Welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. The Pharmacy Leaders Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, with interviews and advice on building your professional network, brand, and a purposeful second income from students, residents, and innovative professionals.
All right. Hey, welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Tony Guerra, and today I have Tim Ulbrich, the founder of the Your Financial Pharmacist group, and then the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Your Financial Pharmacist, it's a community of pharmacy professionals empowering one another to achieve financial freedom. And on today's show, we'll talk about a brand new online student loan course launched by the YFP team. Tim Ulbrich currently serves as the Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Pharmacy Practice at Northeast Ohio Medical University College of Pharmacy. Welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast.
Thank you, Tony. Excited to be here.
Okay, well, let's start. I always ask, just a little bit to get some background on you if somebody's never heard about you before, but I think of you guys as famous, but maybe that's because I've been listening to you for almost a couple of years here. But everyone's leadership road's a little bit different. Tell us a little bit about where you started and how you got to where you are today, specifically with the YFP team.
Yeah, so I've been out of school for about 10 years, graduated from Ohio Northern University, go Polar Bears, in 2008, did my residency in community ambulatory care in 2009 at the Ohio State University, and have been up here on faculty in an administrative role at Northeast Ohio Medical University since 2009. And so I've always been in an academic leadership type of role, and then always have had a passion around personal finance, partly out of the School of Hard Knocks. So I graduated with lots of student loan debt, about $200,000 of student loan debt, went through a journey of really trying to figure out how to pay it back and making a lot of mistakes along the way, having some wins, having some failures. Finally got that paid off in the fall of 2015. And about a week later, I started talking to a lot of pharmacists and kind of heard the message of, wow, like we don't get a lot of personal finance education. And really, we need more of this from the pharmacist angle and perspective. And so I started blogging about my journey, got a lot of great feedback. Long story short, partnered with a former student of mine, Tim Church, and we wrote a book together, Seven Figure Pharmacist, then launched the YFP podcast, and kind of the rest has been history as we've gone on that journey. And I think for me, what gets me so excited is there's so much need in this space for personal finance education. And we'll talk about student loan debt and all of that. And if we can provide value as the YFP team to help people manage this beast that is personal finance and really help alleviate some stress and help give some people some peace and education along the way, I think we're fulfilling our mission, and we're doing that, and we're having fun doing that. And for me, it's been a perfect mix of education in my day job and really going after a passion in personal finance, and also having fun in terms of running a business with it as well. So it's been a fun journey, and I can't wait to see where it goes in the future.
Okay, well, let's start with a couple questions. Then we'll talk about a recent podcast episode you had on student loans in this part one. And then part two will be completely devoted to the student loan course. I want to hear more about it, what's inside. So let's first talk about, I don't want to call it apathy or insensitivity, but I was on Disney cruise with my kids, and they had no concept of money, so they cried sometimes, were unhappy sometimes. Like, how can you be unhappy on a Disney cruise?
Right.
Right. And so we talked about this before the show, but in some ways it feels like monopoly money that you're playing with, or I was thinking maybe it's like hypertensive meds where you have no symptoms, but you have a chronic condition. So recently you talked about there was 130,000 in public, and this isn't the most recent figures. They're not out yet. But from a public College of Pharmacy, you graduated about 130K in debt, from a private 200K. And when you made this announcement, you heard crickets.
Yeah, when I go, we've been speaking at colleges all across the country this past year, and one of the things we'll often lead with is talking about some of the student loan debt and the numbers. And so I'll throw out numbers like 160, 165, depending on the private school, maybe 200, as you mentioned. And literally, Tony, there is no emotional reaction in the room, nothing. And, I always tell that group, like, hey, if the general public heard this data and figure, they would be like, oh my gosh, what do you mean $200,000 a day? And I think that speaks to a few different things. One, until you're in the phase of having to pay it back and actually write the check and you can feel the impact of it, it does in some sense feel like monopoly money. And I can attest to that going through this in my own personal journey, that when I was going through school, It's easy to take out the money at 6, 7, 8% interest, and you don't yet feel the weight and pain of that until you really fully understand the impact that it's going to have on other financial goals. And I think when you get post-graduation, you get to the point of, hey, I'd really like to own a home, and you're starting a family, and these other things come into play. Oh, by the way, retirement. Then you start to look at all these things and say, wow, I wish I had a little bit more money. What happened to my income? Well, there it goes to student loans. And so I think there's also been, kind of a numbness to this feeling in pharmacy education that it is the way it is. I'm going to graduate. I got a pharmacy degree and I'll figure it out after I finish. Well, one of my goals is to really raise some of the concern and hopefully elevate the conversation around this topic, because nobody should look at a number like $160,000 of debt and say, it is what it is, right? And so I try to put it in a way that is tangible, right? So one of the examples I use is, if you graduate with the average indebtedness right now, it's equivalent to about a $300,000 to $350,000 home over a 30-year mortgage in terms of the monthly payment that you're going to make.
I want to cry.
And so a lot of people, and you know this, you hear a lot of pharmacists say, I feel like I'm making 2 mortgage payments. Well, you are, right? When you look at these numbers. And so I think if we can help in any way minimize the indebtedness, or at a minimum, equip people with the tools to help them to handle it, then I think we're on the path to success. But the first thing is, with your own financial journey and trying to teach your kids about this, is you have to feel it, right? You got to feel the emotion of it. You have to recognize the impact that it has before you can say, I'm going to get serious about a plan. Because the only way to get serious about a plan and to execute that plan is to get fired up about it. And I think that's something we need to think about when it comes to student loans.
Well, I think I guess what I got when I talked to Tim Baker, and I want to say this was the very first time I had met him, and he actually used the expression, you feel naked when you start talking about money, your credit score, and things like that. And I guess it's almost difficult for people to come in. And so can you talk a little bit about the YFP Facebook group and kind of how warm and welcoming it is? Because people are coming in and it's like, hi, my name is Tony and I have student loan debt. And that's how I feel coming in. Can you talk a little bit about kind of embracing it and just taking the dive into the pool and saying, okay, well, are there other people that feel this way too?
Yeah, we have to make this topic more welcoming, right? We have to make people comfortable sharing, helping, encouraging each other, sharing wins, asking questions where they're getting stuck. And that was really one of the goals overall with YFP, is to create a community that can empower each other. And then also in the YFP Facebook group, which we would love to have your listeners join that group, is that's a space where you can really come in. We had somebody post this morning and said, hey, I just paid off another student loan. People are like, awesome, congratulations. What was your success? But also, we have people that jump on and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. What do you guys think? Whether it's an insurance question or a student loan question, a home buying question. It's a space where there is no stupid financial question. And I think having a community of pharmacists, pharmacy students, residents, whatever, is that we can relate to the situation that we're all in. And we kind of understand, okay, roughly we're working with this kind of take-home pay. And if you're a resident, you've got other residents that can give you feedback, or people that have gone through that stage. And that's really what that community is about. And as you have seen and witnessed, the conversation in there is incredible. And I'm so excited. It's probably one of the most rewarding things over the last 6 months, is to see how comfortable people are asking questions in that group, and to see how quickly people will jump in and say, hey, we're ready to help. We've got your back here as it relates to this issue.
So when I came out, I was financially ignorant. The word the expression FI, financial independence, I also use for financial ignorance. And when I graduated with, I only had $40,000 in student loans because I only paid $16,000 for college. So that's kind of, people are like, whatever, $40,000. But I just did some dumb things. Like I had $20,000 in credit card debt. And then I also I bought a car in March so I could get off the plane and then get into my new car. And I put a down payment with a credit card. So some dumb things on my part. But I don't want to repeat stuff that you've done in the podcast. Was that in podcast episode 32, Find Your Why with Tim and Jess Ulbrich, like your own story?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about there, and we also have a post on the blog, and I can send it over. We can link in the show notes that kind of chronicles my journey, but also chronicles the top mistakes that I've made. And what's funny is that might actually be the most viewed blog post we've had, because I think people like to hear that, hey, here you are writing a book, doing a podcast, whatever, but you've made a lot of mistakes. And yeah, if we had time, I could tell you all the mistakes I made over the last week, right? That's just the nature of money. And so if we can share those mistakes and learn from one another, and I'm with you, Tony. When I think back to my journey, I had no idea what loans were in terms of subsidized and unsubsidized. I didn't understand interest or compound growth, but I had a commitment to learn, and that's what we want to provide to people, is to say, hey, if you haven't yet been taught this information, that's okay. Let's learn together, and let's learn from our mistakes, so we can obviously all grow in that journey. But I've made similar mistakes, car buying, home buying, you name it. But the reality is I'm better off now because of those mistakes I've made. Some of them I kick myself more for than others. But the reality is, obviously, you learn from those and you grow and you move on.
Yeah. Okay. And then I just want to mention again, so 32 was the episode, and 32 and 33 were the episode with you and Jess. And then episode 36 was the one with Andrea and Tim Church. And then he also made mistakes. So we're all in the same boat in terms of making mistakes. But let's talk a little bit about some of the solutions that you had in episode 52, which was just released, I think, a couple days ago.
Yep.
So let's go over those 5 things. And the first thing was inventory your loans. And when I looked at my loans, I just said, I have $40,000 in loans. I didn't know there was a division. Like, I understood to some extent, something's unsubsidized, something's subsidized, but what does that mean to inventory my loans, and what are the divisions, I guess, of my loans in part 1 of that podcast episode?
Yeah, and I think a lot of students would hear your story and feel that same way. That's the impression I get. Some people may be able to say, yeah, I roughly have 150 or 200,000
yeah,
or
it's
whatever.
just one thing. Yeah.
It's one big number. But what we've realized is that in order to get to the end, and the end for us when it comes to your student loans is being able to choose the best repayment strategy. And to get there, the first thing you got to do is you have to know exactly what you have in terms of all of your loans. And the division of your loans is so important, because which repayment strategy you choose depends on which loans and the types of loans you have. So are these direct loans? Are they subsidized? Are they unsubsidized? Are they FFEL loans? All different types of things. And there's really 3 areas that we talked about on episode 52 of the YFP podcast when it comes to inventorying your loans. First is your federal loans. Second is your private loans. And then the third area I talked about is what we call the bank of mom and dad. So money you have from mom, dad, family, friends, whatever. And so for most listeners, I would say 80 to 90%, if not more, of their loans are probably going to be federal loans. And we can link again into the show notes, and we reference it on the podcast. If you go to nslds.ed.gov or the studentloan.gov repayment estimator, and you log in, once you log in with your federal student aid FSA ID, right away, boom, you'll see an entire list of your loans. You'll be able to see the breakdown, the interest rates, who the servicers of those loans are, and which repayment options are available with each of those loans. And then simultaneously, we recommend you go and do your private loan inventory, which we recommend you start by getting a credit report at annualcreditreport.com to make sure you don't miss anything. Because what we've found out, Tony, is that some people say, I think I have about $10,000 in private loans. And then we do an inventory, and really that number is, 25,
Whoa.
And so
Okay.
you gotta first make sure with an inventory, before we can say, what's the game plan, we have to know exactly what the list is of everything we're working with. And for me, I think this is a big barrier for many people, rightfully so, because a lot of times I think you see big numbers like this, $200,000, especially if there's that kind of numbing effect, and you think, I'd rather I didn't have to worry about this at all, right? And this is really the first step to kind of feeling that emotional pain that I mentioned, where once you start to learn about everything of these individual loans, naturally you start to get a little bit fired up, and you say, all right, let's go. Let's figure out the best way to get these paid off. But step number 1 is you got to inventory your federal loans, your private loans, and then the loans that you have from family and friends.
Okay, well, let's use a medical analogy here. So we've gone to the physician or whatever. We found this is what we've got going on. So then the next thing we go, okay, well, doc, what are my options? And I think that was the next thing you talked about. So can you talk about just the one thing that I think was newest to me when I've been listening to this over the last month is I didn't know that there was forgiveness outside of. I guess I didn't know there was forgiveness for loans outside of the public service sector. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of forgiveness?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up because that's probably the one that people are the least familiar with. So there's really three big buckets that we think about of options available. First is tuition reimbursement. So these would be things like military reimbursement, some employers like the VA and others. If there are these types of options on the table, usually this is the first option that you're going to take because obviously it's free money. For 95% of people listening, they don't have that option on the table. And one of the things we talk about in the course, and we can come back to in part two of this, is there's actually state level programs in terms of tuition reimbursement that a lot of people aren't familiar with, and we reference those in the course. Then there's really the second bucket is what we call the forgiveness bucket. And the two parts of the forgiveness bucket is the public service loan forgiveness program, which we talk a lot about on the podcast as well as on the blog. And so we'd point people there for more information. And essentially in that program is if you work for a qualifying employer, which is for most pharmacists a not-for-profit employer or a government agency for 10 years and you make qualifying payments, at the end of 10 years, your entire balance left is forgiven and it's forgiven tax-free. Sounds incredible. It really is if all the pieces and parts work, but there's certainly some limitations and risks that are associated with the public service loan forgiveness program. As you mentioned, what a lot of people don't realize is that there's actually a non-PSLF forgiveness option or a forgiveness option that is in the federal system, but is not the public service loan forgiveness program. Now, with this program, the big differences from the public service loan forgiveness is that instead of 10 years, you're looking at 20 or 25 years until you reach forgiveness. And instead of that forgiveness being tax-free, you're going to have an income tax bill with the remaining balance. So for most people, this is really not an option they're going to pursue. But for somebody that has a really high debt to income ratio, and we've determined that to be a debt to income ratio that's greater than 2-to-1. So maybe you're somebody that's going to graduate with, say, $300,000 of student loan debt, and you're going to be making approximately $100,000. That'd be a debt to income ratio of 3-to-1. So if you have a very high debt to income ratio and you're working for a for-profit employer, CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid, whomever, this would be an option you at least want to evaluate among the other options to see if it's something that's worthwhile. And obviously, part of making that decision, which we'll come back to here in a few minutes, is what are your feelings about having this around for 20 or 25 years? So those are the two forgiveness options, PSLF and non-PSLF. And then the third option is what we call the non-forgiveness bucket. And this essentially is either keep them in the federal system and pay them off. It could be the 10-year repayment, or it could be paying off with an income-driven repayment plan, or you could obviously pull them out, refinance them with a private lender, and then pay them off anywhere from really 5 to 20 years, depending on the individual lender. So once you do your inventory, then the second step here is really to look at these different options and make sure you understand them in detail so we can then move on and start to do the math and get one step closer to choosing the best repayment plan strategy.
Okay. Well, what I wanted to do is kind of put the 3 and 4 from your last podcast episode together because, and I want to use Kirk and Spock. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Star Trek, Captain Kirk is really an emotional guy, charge forward, move ahead, darn the logic. Whereas Spock was very logical. And, you'd say, well, it would make the most sense to do this and to leave the loans there for 30 years. And then Kirk's like, what? Keep loans for 30 years. Let's pay them off in 3 years, and so we've got this logic versus emotional. And I want to talk especially about partners. So the one thing that you've had, I think, on your episode, I want to say there's maybe 5. There's you, there's Tim Church, and then at least 2 couples, maybe 3 couples that you've had on. Can you tell me a little bit about sorting out the emotional versus the, logical? This would be the least expensive way to do it between partners, because I think that's kind of, I think that everyone ends up being in that eventually.
So important. And so just to tie this together here with our steps 3 and 4, step 3 is do the math. So get all your numbers, get all your data, looking at the different plan options that are available. And then step 4 is layer on top of the math what we call the factors beyond the math. So what are your feelings toward debt? Are you okay with it? Do you hate it? Does it make you anxious? Is what it is to you? What's your family situation? Are you and a spouse or significant other on the same page? What other financial goals do you have? What's the stage of life? And when you can do the math and layer on these factors beyond the math, then we really start to get towards choosing a repayment strategy and option that's best for you. And the reality is, Tony, for your listeners, that option is going to be likely different depending on all of those individual variables. And so there's no one blanket right answer when it comes to student loans. And to your point, when two people are working together, and I can attest to this from my wife and I, because we are so different when it comes to our finances. And those that are on the podcast and listen know this. And I've really come to appreciate how powerful our differences can be when we are talking, communicating, and really leveraging the strength of each other. Now, when we're not, it can be a nightmare, right? So that's the challenge. But when we're working together, I tend to be much more of the kind of rational, logical, let's look at the numbers, let's look at the math. And my wife really focuses more on the opposite end of the spectrum of, thinking about the bigger picture and the family and some of the emotional components and the situations, and not necessarily starting with the math. And taking those two together is really critical, even when we're talking here about student loans. And I think the message there is that you can't just look at the math alone, regardless of where you are in that camp. The math is important, but if somebody does the math on their student loans and they see, ooh, this one option is the best in terms of the math, but it means I'm going to have my loans around for 20 years and I really get anxious about student loan debt, well, the math falls short right there, right? So we have to combine the emotional components, the family situation, other financial goals, stage in life with the math. And when you have two people working together, you've got to be able to balance both of those to see how can we put this together. So if you're somebody that says, hey, I'm all in, I want to get these paid off in 3 years and I want to live off of nothing for 3 years and kill this debt. But a spouse is like, whoa, time out. Like I really have these other goals.
Yeah.
And what about the kids? And no, we can't live off of grocery budget for $300 a month with the kids, Then you got to work together and say, okay, where's the compromise and how do we come to a shared decision? Maybe it's not 3 years, maybe it's not 20 years, maybe it's a 7-year repayment, right? And then you put those variables together and you work together to make sure you're on the same page with that plan.
Yeah, and to point people to the episodes, I think there was, let's see. So I know recently we just had the group from Tempe, Arizona, episode 50, 197,000 in loans in 27 months. And then I think we had an Ethan Co. Was it?
Ethan and Ellen Co. Yes.
Yeah. That I can't find the episode, but that was also another one that, episode 34. So kind of coming together. I feel like it was a physician and a pharmacist, and they were kind of working
Correct.
through residencies, and we've got to work with yours and mine, and then it kind of all came together working as a couple. So I think there's at least 5 or 6 episodes that people can go to for that. Well, let's before we go to the 5th one, determine your payoff strategy. I guess I wanted to talk more than just, okay, well, determine your payoff strategy. This is it. But also, can you talk about becoming part of the group and mid-course corrections? Because let's say I make a payoff strategy right now, there's going to be life events. And
Absolutely.
Each time there's a life event, we really need to kind of come back and say, okay, is my payoff strategy still makes sense? So for me, if somebody had the same thing I did, which was to have 3 children at the same time, to have my wife not work for 6 months, to be on hospital bed rest for, half that time, and then in the NICU with them half that time. First, can you talk about determining the payoff strategy? And second, how do you maintain contact with a group that can, or a person like Tim Baker that can evaluate what your strategy is or how that affects that payoff?
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Tony. And I can relate to that as well, obviously, as I think about where I am at today in my financial situation with 3 young kids is very different than where I was 7 years ago pre-kids, right? And which repayment plan works if I still had my student loans now would be very different than it was when I first graduated from school. And so when we get to this step number 5, this step number 5 is really about obviously putting these 4 steps together and actually choosing a repayment strategy and plan. And we'll talk about more in part 2 about what the course provides to get you here. But this is a step where you look at, okay, I've got 8 or more, believe it or not, 8 or more federal repayment options that are available to me. So unfortunately, the federal government has not made this very easy to choose from. Surprise when it comes to easy navigation, right? I think confusion might actually be part of the strategy here. So you actually have more than 8 federal repayment options. So you have the standard 10-year repayment. You have an extended payment, a graduated payment, and then you have this series of payment plans that are called the income-driven repayment plans that calculate a monthly payment based on a percentage of what is your discretionary income, and those fluctuate as your income fluctuates. And all of those have different nuances and pros and cons. So not only do you have those options, but then you have the variable around forgiveness, like we talked about. Yes, forgiveness, no forgiveness. And then you also have a whole host of options in the private sector when it comes to refinancing. And so we have a whole section of our website dedicated to refinancing where you can learn more, find out who it's for, who it's not for, what to look for. That's at yourfinancialpharmacist.com/refinance. And so, Tony, when you put all these options together, people often get to this phase and they get paralyzed because they're like, I don't know what to do. And I don't know which of these options is best for my personal situation. And in order to get to this point, you've got to walk through the variables we already talked about with inventorying your loans, looking at your available options, and so forth. And so to your point, though, one of the good things when it comes to student loans is that you do have flexibility to change with your personal situation changing. But there's one important caveat that people have to be aware of. If and when you take your loans out of the federal loan system into the private sector, if you were to refinance, once you go into the private sector, you can never go back into the public federal system. So if you think for whatever reason, whether it be loan forgiveness that you might pursue or some other variable, if for whatever reason you might need the benefits of the federal loan repayment system, you obviously don't want to yet make that move to a refinance. However, within the federal loan repayment system, you can choose repayment plans at any given time. So Tony, to your point, kind of leading up to this portion of the show, if I were to choose, say, the one income-driven plan, and then my family situation changes and I need to pivot to something else, or all of a sudden I can make bigger payments, you have the option to choose and switch between federal payment plans. But once you refinance into the private system, which for many listening actually probably would be a move to consider, but the downside of that, if you do that option, is you're then giving up the federal repayment option. So you first really want to evaluate through these steps that we talked about on the show today, do I need the federal system or not? And usually the answer to that is, am I going to pursue forgiveness or not? The second you say forgiveness is not for me, then usually more often than not, refinance is going to be a play to consider.
Okay. Well, great. We'll finish part 1 there, and then we'll start part 2, and we'll start talking about the student loan course.
Great. Thanks for having me on, Tony.
Support for this episode comes from the audiobook Memorizing Pharmacology, a relaxed approach. With over 9,000 sales in the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, it's the go-to resource to ease the pharmacology challenge. Available on Audible, iTunes, and Amazon.com, in print, ebook, and audiobook. Thank you for listening to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. Be sure to share the show with the hashtag #PharmacyLeaders.